This time on Poll Hub, the election's over. Well, it's probably over. I digress. There are two very big contests yet to be decided. That's what we want to talk about. Not one, but two Senate seats in Georgia that will be filled in a runoff election set for January 5th. And why do we care? Well, the balance of power in the Senate hangs on these races. And what makes them even more interesting is Biden appears to have won Georgia, the first time a Democratic presidential candidate has done that since 1992. Also, potentially great news on COVID. A vaccine appears to be 90% effective in testing, but what happens if half of America declines to get it once it's made available? That and an update on the pre-election polling autopsy currently underway. Spoiler alert, it's too soon. It's not too soon for another episode of Poll Hub, so here we go. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Miringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
And we've got Georgia on our mind. Did you ever notice how many songs have Georgia? There's so many songs about Georgia. I was thinking about making something in the open where we use one of these many Georgia. There are a million songs about Georgia.
No. Overused.
Midnight Express, the Midnight Express to Georgia.
That's why I didn't do that. So, because there's too many. You're right. But it was kind of fun. Anyway, Georgia. Wow. So the Senate, as it stands right now, there are two seats that are undecided. They're both in Georgia. They're both going to be decided in a runoff on January 5th. And if Democrats win both, they control the Senate, the House, and presumably the White House. So it's kind of a big deal, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, Barb, take a shot at it.
No,
you can
I
go
was
first.
I was gonna go a little more pessimistic for Democrats and a little bit more optimistic for Republicans. I mean, right now, with the call of the races for Senate in North Carolina and Alaska, the Republicans now have 50 seats in the Senate. And yes, if the Democrats do win, and they have to win both Senate seats in Georgia, and that also means that with the recount that one of them, the Purdue seat, doesn't get over 50%. I think it's pretty close at 49.7 or something in the current count. That they will both be runoff elections. But I think it's a real tall order for Democrats, given the fact that general elections, presidential elections, are the highest turnout of most elections that we have. Certainly, this one was the largest we've seen, and still counting. But in quite some time, but I think it's a real tall order for the Democrats to mobilize to that extent, given that they had the amount of early vote that they did in Georgia, and time for mail voting in Georgia. So I'm thinking that Georgia goes back to how we remember it. Rather than be, a prize in both instances for the Democrats.
Yeah, and because of their rules about runoffs in Georgia, they have had some, and typically the turnout is lower than for the general election. And then also the Republicans have tended to do much better in the second round. Although I think this is a little bit different because we're sort of setting the tone for what Washington will be like, gridlock or unity. And I think that's a message that the Democrats can drive home. And I do think, I'll play devil's advocate for a second. Of course, Stacey Abrams did very well in a near win for governor in Georgia and last time. So that is Georgia is changing in terms of its turnout. I think the fact that Warnock and Ossoff are sort of running as a tag team there does help for the Democrats. But there is one thing that I find interesting, because politics is always fun to follow, and not as much lately. But in this case, we have the Republicans are saying, we really have to defeat the Democrats in Georgia, because else Biden will have the Senate, the House, and the Democrats, obviously the White House. And yet they're not agreeing that he's actually won. So we're getting both sides of the message. President-elect Biden, who we're not going to call president-elect, should not be given the full reign of government in three branches, which we're not admitting that he has already. So I just find that, just laden with irony right now.
I think this is look. There's no dispute that runoffs in Georgia favor Republicans, and generally not in a small way, but in a really large way. And Ossoff didn't win this race. He came in second. It's just that Purdue didn't get to 50% because there's a third party candidate. So all the magic 8-ball says is Democrats aren't going to pull this off. What about two things, though? One is every runoff in Georgia before this, none of them have been a national election. This is a second national election. There will be $100 million, maybe $200 million spent on ads, on mobilization, all that. Volunteers are going to flood the state and knock on doors and drag people to the polls. This is essentially the presidential race part two. We have seen races that have been very, very important that have come after an election in other cases. The Doug Jones race in Alabama, for instance. I just wonder if this is so exceptional, the circumstances, that maybe the magic 8-ball, in which all signs point to Republicans holding one or probably both of the seats, is maybe not something to be necessarily put most of your faith in this time.
Yeah, well, it's a possibility. I mean, it is going to have national attention. I think it's interesting to see how the Democrats do that in terms of having, fundraising from external sources, and the accusation from the Republicans that it's not really being local, but it's, AOC and the socialists are back in, trying to influence the outcome. And then you have the question, what does Donald Trump do? How do they get the Donald Trump group mobilized to show up when he's not on the ballot? This is, in a sense, an early test of what happens when, Trump is sort of in the distance, but not really on the ballot. And can he turn out, the party faithful and his loyalists on the notion that, help out Mitch McConnell? And I think that's a little bit of an interesting question that we're going to get answered. But clearly, you can't bet against the Republicans, given that the fundamentals are in their favor, at the starting gun on this.
Yeah, and we definitely, we saw such significant turnout in November on both sides, for Republicans, for Trump, and Democratic mobilization. It's right after New Year's, right after New Year's weekend. So certainly there will be a lot going on. It'll also depend on what exactly is going on with COVID too. I think that's a very significant issue when we look at voting in general. It certainly was for the November election. It changed the dynamics and how people voted, and so right now we actually see there's no state that is immune from rising cases. According to all the trackings, we're seeing coronavirus cases are increasing across the U.S. More than 100,000 cases a day. And as I mentioned, a lot of people showed up on election day and prior to election day and voted, saying that coronavirus was a very significant issue for them in their vote. Feeling that there was much more that could be done. I think that, Georgia aside, we're looking at a period of time now where that is becoming front and center. But Jay, you also mentioned that there's a lack of trust. There's a lack of trust in our healthcare system, and there's a lack of trust in vaccines. And so I wonder, there has been, some positive news, and we can talk about the Pfizer results for their most recent vaccine. But there's a bigger concern that whether people will actually trust the system enough to be able to take the vaccine to move forward. What's some of the data show and polling show on this particular issue?
I think, just a second, I'll get there. I do think it's ironic that some of the people who have been most resistant to science in this discussion over the last 8 or 9 months are in many cases, the same people who say a vaccine will save us. I'm not sure I get how those two things work when some of this polling suggests that a lot of Americans aren't going to be getting the vaccine, at least not right out of the gate. Gallup, a poll in late September, 50% of Americans willing to get a vaccine. 50%. That means 50% aren't, pretty close to it. There's some, I'm sure, that are unsure in that. It was 61% the month prior. So, there's movement in there. In October, CNN asked same question once one becomes available. 51% say willing to get vaccinated if one becomes available, basically the same number. And then Suffolk, right before the election, October 23rd through October 27th, Suffolk University, only a little over a quarter, 26% say they would take a vaccine as soon as they can. 47% wait while others have taken it to see. 20% won't take the vaccine at all. That's probably the most positive poll that we've seen, in that you've got 73% saying, well, I would take it, maybe, I just want to see if it works. I want to make sure people don't have bad reactions and stuff. That's the most positive, and yet 1 in 5 say not taking the vaccine. That's a lot.
I think this is where I think this is where political leadership has to fill a void. And I think there's potentially a huge difference between a president who politicized wearing a mask and obviously supporters who flaunted that and still are at these, super spreader events, and a president who might line up visibly, takes the vaccine in front of a national audience and says, here, now join in, and pushes the value of this as something that, talking about the polio vaccine. I mean, there's different ways you can present this beyond what's in the abstract right now. And as you say, if people see other people doing this and it not having a negative impact on their health, then it may have a change in these numbers. The thing I find very interesting, and Barbara and I were just talking about this the other day, is in these trials that we're waiting eagerly to get the results of, there are, people who are taking these trials. Think of the unselfishness.
Thousands of people who have signed up for.
Who are in the process of taking these very experimental drugs because they have not made it, to any degree of certainty at this point, medically, and even the Pfizer one is hasn't been peer reviewed by the journal. It's really just at a press release stage. Although everybody, including Fauci, is saying it, things are looking good. But think of these people who are willing to give of themselves and possibly their own health to improve the lot of others. What a different tone that is for an America that's somehow all about me and what people say is hopelessly divided. Not so for everybody, apparently.
One thing, though, Barb, that I wonder about, because we've talked about it a lot on the show for the last, few years, and that is that everything we poll, there's a partisan divide, practically everything. In fact, I think there was something in a show recently where we spent a lot of time talking about the one thing we could find that didn't have partisan divide. It just seems that there is some reasonable possibility that a vaccine being released becomes a talking point for people who are not fans of Joe Biden, and it's the Biden vaccine, that kind of thing. We've seen that a lot in the last few years, especially with things. And you look in the polling and you look at the partisan breakdown of who's willing to take a vaccine and who's not and all that. I mean, 53% of Democrats say they'd get a vaccine in that Gallup poll. 49% say they're willing to, of Republicans. So that's very close. Other polls have shown a much bigger discrepancy. I just wonder if that's not a real risk of going into 2021 with a number of vaccines becoming available, hopefully.
No, sure, but Joe Biden, no Joe Biden. I mean, the Senate, changing leadership or not. I think we've been in a period, though, where we have seen a decline in trust in institutions overall, and certainly the politicization of, most of the issues that are being debated publicly. I think, though, one of the changes, though, that you're likely to see, I would think, when it comes to a Biden administration, and I think it's something we've gotten so used to, over the last number of years, is that the press conferences and updates about vaccines and how the country is doing in COVID has really been done by the president himself. In the past, when we've looked to other emergencies, whether they be terror or national disasters or health, the folks that have been front and center for communicating to the public have been those people who are experts and in charge of those areas, whether it's Homeland Security or whether it's doctors and the CDC or the Surgeon General. So one of the things that just may be a little flip of the switch is the fact that I don't think Joe Biden is going to be someone who's going to be standing in front of the podium discussing the latest updates on vaccines. I would hope not.
Or tweeting about it.
And so that it moves back out of the political realm and back into the medical one.
Yeah, if the temperature gets lowered, and it's a good point. I mean, if there's a lowering of the temperature, not the partisan temperature, that's going to happen, but the lowering of the media temperature,
right?
I think that has the potential to be a big difference. Yeah. Lee, I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, and the parties, as we, have talked about, and this election was no different. They're two parties narrowly divided in terms of their size, but widely split in terms of their outlook. And I think Joe Biden's got a tall order in front of him, and maybe the vaccine becomes a way of doing that. But as we know, and as we've said many times on the podcast here, that science is messy. And now we have another example where, in this case, it cuts a little closer to home. We're going through a lot of talk about the utility and value of polls, and the history, which we've talked about, is not necessarily the one that we adhere to. But the polls in 2016 got it wrong. We didn't, but others did. The polls in 2018, well, they actually were okay for most polling organizations, but that gets put in the back burner on this. But then we come right back to 2020, and wow, wasn't it supposed to occur very differently than it did? And yet the polls probably, I would think, had lots of value and continue to, but there is a need on the part of the polling community to investigate and see what's going on. I know this is a topic we've had to spend the last week talking about. And one of the first things Barbara said to me right off the bat is, whenever you're talking to a reporter, if you don't say, let's get the count done before we can look at the numbers, then it's all premature. But Barb, where do you assess the polling industry at this point on the assumption that the election did not go the way the pollsters thought it would, and it seemed to be industry-wide? It wasn't one poll, two polls. Our numbers weren't that bad, but most of the polls, just weren't where they need to be. They weren't spot on.
And look, there was like in 2016, and I think this is actually the only similarity between 2016, because I think 2020 presents some different issues for polling. But the similarity is that reality doesn't meet expectations. And so it's a very dramatic thing to see on election night. I think it was also exacerbated by the fact that what we were watching on election night and what most people were watching on election night were the numbers coming in for election day, which, although everyone had talked about the fact that they would be very Republican because Republicans had planned to vote on election day, whereas Democrats voted early,
Red Mirage.
it's still, yeah, but it still has a very significant impact. If look, we know television is an incredible medium. And a very powerful medium. And when media is speaking really with one voice, that is the same numbers, we're all going to end up with a very similar impression. That said, there's certainly a lot that needs to be reevaluated with polling. Is polling dead? I'd say no. In fact, if you look at this week, there are polls that are already out on the Georgia race, on coronavirus, on a whole host of issues. So there's a lot to be said for the value of polling. I think one of the things that is particularly important, even when you're looking at election polls themselves, is that the campaigns are going to continue to poll. What public polls do is at least they let Americans and the public in on the secret of the strategies and what the campaign polls are going to be showing. As you mentioned, Lee, this was endemic to all polling, campaign polls as well as public polls. I see that a couple things that as we've mentioned here, that we're going to be looking at going forward is still geography. I think we need to continue to look at geography. It's not about modeling.
It's certainly not about wait. Yeah, I was going to say, certainly not just about waiting. That was the fix in 2016, and obviously,
which wasn't a fix.
Which we've talked about.
We'll continue to look at geography, and the other key thing that really seems to be significant is what I mentioned at the top, which was the fact that there's a difference between Democrats and Republicans and when they voted. And that was very different this time for pollsters. We had so much early vote, and we did have to make guesses about what those proportions were. So I think there's a lot to review. I think there's also still a lot of positive things to understand. As you said, Lee, polling and science is messy. It's not perfect, but it is our best guess.
So we'll probably have more on this. I'm just guessing. My best guess is we'll have more on this in future episodes of Poll Hub. The count, as a reminder, the count is not done or final in really any state. It's not certified. So wait, hold your breath.
A couple of them have certified.
A few have certified. We don't have final numbers, so a lot to look at once we do. And we'll have plenty more to talk about. For now, that's going to do it for this edition of Poll Hub, though. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff, our editor. Amelia Morel, Leo Ruiz, Maddie Jones, Marcella Bettman are our production assistants. Marcella is also our editor, and he has a big, tall order to make us sound as good as we do. If we sound good, I don't know. Maybe we don't even sound good.
I was just going to add that you don't know how many edits this has. It sounds like we just did it because of Marcella's work, front to end. Maybe not, but the Roper Center will be doing its annual award dinner, the Matovsky Award. It will be remote, but it's an event with some post-election discussion and panels, and we do rely on them for the Roper Center Archives at Cornell for lots of good information about trends and the like. Barb, you get the last word.
Yeah, if you have, we ask every time, and some of you do give us some great ideas as to things to talk about on Poll Hub. So please continue to do so. You can follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter at Marist Poll, and give us your questions, your comments. We love to see them. Most of them, no, actually all of them. But until next time, stay safe.